And that's it. So please welcome Adrianne Harun.
Hi, everyone. When I was a kid, I never understood the Oscars. It seemed like it should be a great show, like lots of beautiful people that were pretending to be real people and pretty clothes. And then it turned into this whole litany of thank yous that I just never, ever got. I wanted there to be jokes instead when they got up there. And as I've gotten older, I've realized just how everything that I do, they say everybody stands on somebody's shoulders over and over again, but gratitude is in my bones right now because I owe so many people so much. But I'm not really going to do the old big thank yous. Oops, what did I drop? Oh, somebody's clips. So I'm just going to say in the infamous words of the drunken bride at the first wedding, in that classic 4 weddings and a funeral, I love you. I love you all. I don't know you, but I love you too. The Sewanee Review didn't ask me to do one of these things, so I don't have this to read, which is really a good thing in a way because I would have taken up their whole thing there. Because I don't know where I would begin with Wyatt. So I'm going to put Wyatt over here for just a second and just thank a few people that maybe haven't been thanked yet. First of all, Miriam Berkeley, who has been one of our witnesses, our companion for all these years. Miriam still has incredible photographs over here that are for sale. There's been a rumor that one day maybe those could be made into a book, which would be fantastic. I think we would all want that coffee table book. I'd like to thank Margot. I would not be standing here. Margot set me on my path and she got me here along with some help from Alice McDermott. So I can't thank you two enough. Tim O'Brien and our incredible workshop. You have to pinch yourself when you're sitting next to Tim O'Brien for 5 workshops. It's pretty incredible. So Wyatt, I don't want to thank you right now. What I want to do is offer you some wishes. I wish you and yours good health. I wish you many, many new poems, each more satisfying and surprising and thrilling than the last. I wish air plenty, clear skies with perhaps a few interesting currents so that you're always having fun. Should you be afflicted with insomnia, instead of worrying about the conference or counting sheep, I hope you can start thinking and counting about everyone who has stood at this podium and said thank you to you. And finally, I hope that mostly, I wish that you and Barbara get a massive return on your many psychic and social investments, that the generosity and brilliance and love that you've shown so many come back to you 100-fold with much joy and happiness. So I might cry. So another thank you to Wyatt, this book. I'm going to read from this book called Catch Release. It's a book of stories, and they are mostly grief-soaked, but in a kind of lighthearted, fun way. And there's a line from the title story. I can't read the title story right now. It does make me cry. But there's a line in it that says, "It's all about loss. Don't kid yourself. Even a simple game of catch is hinged on the moment the ball leaves the glove, the moment it returns. Don't even try to think this story or any story is about something else." That seems to be my compelling interest right now, that moment of suspension that we live in, which can go either way and which is full of promise and full of suspense and full of threats. And speaking of which, I'm going to read a little tale. I know you've all sat through many readings, even today. So if you want to close your eyes, I will not take it personally. If you snore, I might. But other than that, it's called A Dead Man's Land. Dom had been just shy of 3 years old when Sven brought him to us, a smidgen of a being already saddled with a clouded past. No young mother in tow, only that brash father with his heavy pockets tearing through the county as if bearing a heat-seeking map. The pair, who arrived in a late model car so shiny it looked as if it had been waxed every mile, might have landed from the moon. They seemed so insensible of ordinary protocol. It was noted, for instance, how the toddler boy perched without restraint on the milky leather upholstery, his mittened hands clutching the ridged dashboard, the father oblivious to danger. How far had they traveled like this? No one knew, and if anyone did inquire, say a smitten shop girl, Sven would look right past her, pausing long enough to make her remember and regret every awkward moment of her life. At the town's single hotel, once elegant, still genteel, the bellhop noted hardly any luggage in the trunk. And when he went to park the car, he was struck by the vehicle's cleanliness, the lack of even a gum wrapper, a faint metallic odor, its only noticeable stain. The child possessed no visible toys, no soft scrap of coddled flannel. His father, it seemed, was his sole diversion and comfort. Although Sven barely returned the attention, the boy followed him, imitating as best he could that long, confident stride. And as the child tired, before he tired, the young father, barely more than a boy himself, would lift the child absentmindedly onto his hip, and Dom would turn his face towards Sven's tight shoulder as if embarrassed at having to succumb to sleep so publicly, so helplessly. Need a drink here. The land Sven pursued was part of a place local Choctaws once called Nahapalaha or Nahapoalaha, the name translating loosely to marked by the beast, a label white settlers believed indicated prime hunting grounds. Those settlers had lusted after the land as much as Sven and fabricated claims. They'd booted out the Indians as soon as they could, only to discover a dearth of game on that pristine acreage. Such disappointment, but not one of them ready to suggest they give it back. They had principles, hadn't they? Trumpeting desires. Over time, the land had been divided among 3 ordinary white families. Those families farmed a bit and raised fancy-wooled sheep, Cotswolds and Caracools, and considered themselves the town cream. When Sven began to nose around, making shallow, insinuating offers, they laughed him off at first. Then, out of necessity, the man would not relent. They brought out guns and dogs and threats. A normal man would have fled, or at the least scaled down his hopes and retreated to another part of the country. Not Sven. He hovered in town, practicing his steely dimples on flustered bankers as he patiently awaited a shift. Almost on cue, the neighboring families began to fall apart. Kruger got the cancer. Milton's eldest, never handy, had that accident with the chainsaw. Sanderson's wife ran off with her own brother. Yet one by one, the old families succumbed to ruin and madness, and soon Dom's cocky young father presided over an overgrown paradise of field and meadow and tangled hardwood forest fused with that old bad luck. Only a fool would trespass after that. 19 years later, the glorious parcel would still be called Dead Man's Land, a name the nearly grown Dom would relay to a little girl without a shred of irony during the afternoon Sven himself was buried. "But it is a dead man's land now, isn't it?" the little girl asked Dom, pleased with her own cleverness. She was Sven's niece, a relation previously unknown to Dom, arrived with her parents for the funeral. The little girl in her Sunday skirt and Dom, still in his bereavement suit, had just crossed the edge of the notorious woods and were wading through a dappled clearing strewn with birdfoot violet. "Actually, no," Dom said. "It's mine now, and I ain't dead yet, am I?" "Nope, not yet," the little girl said, offering a smirk that stung with familiarity. It had been Dom's idea, sparked and sudden, to take this new cousin on a tour of the land, and an observer might be forgiven for seeing a lovely synchronicity to this invitation. Dom, the new heir, ushering another child along the property edges the way Sven had once led him. Back then, Sven had used toddler Dom as mere audience, witness to a triumph the boy wouldn't fully understand or care about for years. A dog might have served the same purpose. The greedy-eyed girl was another story. She vibrated with an intemperate hunger Dom well recognized. She's out to find trouble, he thought. Well then. We'll go through a forest, Dom had promised her back at the farmhouse, straight into a secret world. Secret, she scoffed, but her tiny pointed eyebrows had raised, and barely suppressing a jig, she accepted his outstretched hand and let him lead her away from the post-funeral giddiness into the bristled, honeyed fields behind Sven's house. The birdfoot violet behind them, they reached a hedge of snowberry bushes. Masses of them, a cloud on a hill. The girl darted forward to finger the white berries, but Dom tugged her along, the tiny hand surprisingly rough in his palm. Come on now, he called over his shoulder, as she half tumbled behind him down a steep pebbled path. This is what you wanted, isn't it? A breeze rose and sharpened, wailing. They followed the path to a stream, and then followed the stream into a rock tunnel and out again, where the gem of Dom's inheritance lay, a hidden lagoon surrounded by high rock walls and a stretch of yellow sand beach, a place so private not even bird song breached the silence. It is secret, the little girl gloated, sassy again. It's my secret place. Dom might have corrected her. Mine, he could have said, not yours. But she would find out soon enough, he reckoned, how deep his fortunes ran. What Dom had owned. Nothing, not one damn thing. He'd roamed through childhood like an animal, a creature without knowledge of pockets or locked doors. Sven might have believed that his son's needs remained simple, any ambition craven and unformed. Still, on the day he'd come into his majority, Dom had been consumed by an unreasonable excitement, half expecting his father to deed him a bit of the woods or even present him with his first steady allowance, a token for 21 years of filial servitude. So silly. Of course, Sven had let the day elapse without a nod. Dom had been stunned by his own reaction. A blistering fury rushed through him, blued his vision, hazed the light. For hours he could not see straight. He banged out of the house and spent the light of his birthday flailing through a forest raked with sudden violent winds, limbs cracking around him as he cursed the land that should be his and the father who kept it from him. Was he worth nothing? Had he no birthright? Dom knew better. Any other young man surely would have confronted Sven, had it out with him with smashed up walls and bloodied fists, and perhaps Dom would have as well if Sven's own illness, virulent and deadly swift, had not appeared almost the next day as if a rebuke to the man's selfishness, or a wish. Yes, sure, Sven's illness seemed to arrive as a granted wish, as if the entire town had drawn a communal winning lottery ticket. Dom knew no one would be challenging that bequest. Only the most recent girlfriend mourned Sven, but as the townspeople told each other, that gal had only known him less than a month, and most of those weeks he'd spent near mute dying. Who wouldn't feel something for a sweet-looking, too young fellow dying before his time? By then, the rest of the town had long learned to see past those charmed looks. Scars and wounds, lost fortunes, nightmares crowded with ravaged daughters and white-faced trembling sons, eviscerated pets, dawn fires, the chilling appearance of Sven at one's kitchen table, playing with knives. No, each had his own image of the man in mind, none of it attractive. If Dom's father had been alive, well, maybe she might have ventured back at the end, not to say goodbye, God knows, but like them, to verify Sven wasn't indulging in a brutal bit of cleverness. If she'd been alive, too, perhaps she might have challenged the legacy to Dom, and if she had, they would have understood she was acting not out of greed, but from concern that Sven's temperament, his very being, had soaked into the spoiled land and would contaminate Dom, her only child. A legitimate worry, they'd agree. The man was bad luck, pure and simple. Dom's mother had spent years trying to get Sven out of her blood, they'd heard, and they'd also heard that in the end, she too had surrendered and taken up a straight razor to quicken the task. He prepared his father's funeral alone, the girlfriend having decamped as soon as it was clear nothing would be coming her way. She did squawk when she heard Dom's plans. "A party," she said, disbelieving. "Are you crazy?" He'd engaged a fancy caterer from 40 miles away and planned a real reception to follow a memorial service and a burial smack in the center of town in the gated churchyard cemetery. As slight as her acquaintance was with Sven, the girlfriend had been shocked. Surely Dom realized how Sven would have treated his efforts. The minister certainly did. He shook through the brief service, waiting for the church to burst into flames as he cobbled together lies about Sven. A businessman, he called him, a citizen leader, and didn't they all hold their breath until the specks of ash and clots of dust and bone were lowered? Dom's lonely flower and that first shovelful of rocks pinging against not a casket, but an old Dante cigar box tied with heavy twine? Released. Yes, they were released, and as they moved farther and farther from the gravesite in the dingiest corner of an already shaded cemetery, as they moved toward the narrow lane, then out to the open parking lot, the huddle unfolded. Heads were thrown back, shoulders slapped in relief. Sure, they told Don. Of course, we'll see you back at the house. Where did the others imagine Dom and the little girl had gone? To see non-existent chickens or the goats Sven had kept for target practice? Someone must have noticed their absence because it seemed the whole town had crowded into the house. Now that the grave was secured, they had no qualms about drinking Sven's liquor and partaking of the endless stacks of sandwiches, truly good sandwiches that the out-of-town caterer kept supplying. A tray of ham and cheese on French baguette, roast beef and horseradish on sweet white bread, and more, another tray of real pork barbecue, smoky and fat, piled high on soft white buns besides bowls of vinegary slaw. A few ever-generous souls had brought by salads and casseroles, baskets of cookies and brownie bars, tiny berry cobblers. The famished group, you couldn't call them mourners, couldn't get enough. They sprawled over Sven's furniture and dirtied his china. They rummaged through his cupboards for more whiskey, for tins of imported smoked fish, for the cigars they knew he favored. Soon they were checking out the medicine cabinets and bureau drawers. Mementos slipped in and out of pockets. Envelopes were perused. Fears of a curse began to shimmy away. They watched those familiar fears faded, the furniture growing more solid, the paint on the walls brighter. A browning houseplant in the kitchen corner even revealed new buds, a flower opening. The house creaked uncomfortably with snorts of real laughter. One fellow grabbed a concertina from his car, another a fiddle. "Good Lord," whispered the stepmother of the little girl to herself. "Will they start dancing next?" She hadn't known Sven, they'd learned. The little girl, 9 years old, was her husband's child from an early marriage that had ended tragically. Dom's uncle had heard of Sven's death only the day before the service, and he and his family must have run from their house into car and onto plane because they arrived 20 minutes early, causing all manner of panic until Sven's brother, the uncle, the spitting image, began to speak. Then they knew he wasn't Sven, come back to life to taunt them for their brief joy. Sven's brother had a delicate, thoughtful way about him. He admired the spill of lilies Dom had ordered, the altar cloths, the wary neighbors themselves. He thanked everyone for knowing Sven, thanked them so much they were soon certain he himself had never made his brother's acquaintance. The wife was something else. She sized them all up as if drawing up ledgers in an account book, adding and subtracting potential worth until they were all shamefaced with debt. She kept her distance, not even prowling the house with the rest of them. With an untouched plate of food on her knee, she took wincing sips of iced tea she refused to sweeten as if it were medicine and she was on a timed regimen. This uncle and his family, they were strangers to Dom as well, but when he'd found the number in Sven's desk, he'd called. Other than Dom, that brother was the last of Sven's living relations, last surviving, it was noted more than once. No one wondered where the brother had been all this time. If it had been any of them, you bet they would never have looked up Sven. The story was that when the brother and Sven were children, Sven had burned down the family house with his parents, 2 sisters, and this brother bolted within. The brother had jumped from a high window, broken both legs and a few ribs. A lung had collapsed. His hands had been badly burned. No one else survived. Sven was 7, and rocking on his heels across the street while the fire burned, he'd nursed a satisfied grin that lit his little angel face. People put it down to shock at first, then a childish accident in the early hours of dawn, except for those who knew him. He went to live with one ill-fated foster family after another. The neighbor who took the brother in wouldn't have Sven and eventually left the state, careful to erase all possibilities of a forwarding address as she and the brother went. Sven bragged about this and bragged, too, about how he kept track of them nonetheless. Their every movement, he'd say, adding, "I scare the shit out of them." Now here the brother was, the image of Sven, brave at last and scaring the shit out of them, arriving with his bookkeeper wife and this elfin child, Dom's only cousin, Delphine. "Like the flower," the girl told Dom. He shook his head. "The fish," he corrected, "like the fish. Dolphin, it means." She laughed, not the giggle of a child, but a full-throated appreciation. They'd hit it off right away. She caught a fly with one hand. Sven could do that, and like her, he never let the fly go, but played with it a while. Sent outside to play with the town children, she seemed shy at first, lingering on the edges. A moment later, the high-pitched cry of an animal in distress. Kin, Dom thought. Yes, she is kin, and he knew where he needed to take her. The uncle was a different story, mild as milk. Dom had taken an instant dislike to the uncle and his wife. Not my mother, she clarified. The girl clarified. Karen, who knew every penny spent and recognized straight away there weren't enough of them. Maybe he left you something, the stepmother told her husband after Dom's call. He was your brother. He might have wanted to make amends. After the funeral, she sipped her bitter tea and balanced her plate. The stepmother listened and learned all that Dom had inherited. A fortune, the best land in the state, a perfect paid-for house. The boy worked as a sales lackey in an office. He was all alone in the world. She found her husband on the back porch surveying the well-tended garden, blood-red tomatoes bursting from an ash manure. My father used fish heads as fertilizer, the uncle said. His tomatoes stopped traffic. You could ask, she said. He has no other family. A pair of town children giggled onto the back porch and were immediately corralled by their mother, who lost her own smile when she saw the uncle. Hush, she said to the children. A man is dead. The uncle seemed not to hear her. His eyes were on the little girls. Seen Delphine? He asked his wife. If the girl disappeared, the stepmother would not grieve. There had been incidents. No, the stepmother wouldn't miss the girl. Of course she had noted Delphine's absence that afternoon, but she'd also felt safe for the moment and could not help but lie. A moment ago, in the kitchen, drawing pictures, eating cookies. Eating cookies, the uncle said. Drawing pictures. Delphine? The stepmother's mouth twisted in an imitation of a smile, an idea forming. She likes it here, she said. The girl wanted to go swimming. She was a fish, she confessed without a hint of a smile. She could swim a mile underwater. No one but he had guessed that. She'd kept it a secret, even in the public pool where she'd startled the young lifeguard by swimming lap after lap underwater. She'd emerged a pretender, gasping, although she had no need. She didn't explain all this to Dom, but eyed the trembling water of the hidden lagoon and wondered what lay beneath it. And he could tell from long experience she was calculating how far she could convince Dom to go with her, if she could drag him to the deepest point, if he would survive. She was wearing her dance class leotard and a Sunday swirl skirt. She could swim in the leotard, no problem. Even if Dom wanted to, he wouldn't have been able to dissuade her. The expression in her eyes was all Sven's. Dom shrugged his shoulders, slipped off his shoes and socks, stripped down to his shorts. Sven had never frightened Dom. In fact, Dom might have been the only soul in the world who'd made Sven both uneasy and helpless. One of Sven's more dramatic girlfriends once claimed that little Dom brought a dead dog back to life. his childish fingertips searching and searching until he pulled out all 6 of the bullets Sven had shot into the creature before stroking the tangled, bloodied fur until it grew glossy and the dog began to breathe again as if sleeping off a long, carousing night. He had left the bullets on his father's pillow. A fantastic story, of course. Yet men in town talked about how Dom would show up at the tavern just as Sven began to ripple, the force of his anger so strong the bar top trembled. Even the owner would try to slip out the back door, already reconciled to ruin. Dom, 6 or 8 or 11. Dom, a rangy 13-year-old with oddly perfect teeth and shaggy blonde hair, would hardly need to step inside the door before Sven was on his feet and out in the parking lot, his perfectly restored truck spitting gravel against the glossy fenders, and the kid left to walk home, pursing that look-alike smile of Sven's. Did anyone dare offer him a ride, even out of gratitude? They did not. Yes, such miracles were common tales, albeit unseen by most. Rumors dashed in and out of houses, through the schools and churches and the sheriff's office, but no one ever thought to share them with Dom himself. Even when he left school and might easily have peeled off a stack of Sven's bills and gone his own way, Dom stuck around as if to keep an eye on Sven. He got a job working with the local insurance agent, wore the same black suit 5 days a week, peddled life and major medical, terrible policies with sky-high deductibles and dismal payouts. Customers pitied him, but only the more desperate and foolish found themselves signing, and his commissions were few. In the evenings and on weekends, Dom minded his father's property, doing whatever chores Sven wrote down on a slip for him. Briefly, he dated a girl from the office, but she ended up marrying another fellow, all in a rush and moving away. On the surface, the water appeared almost clear, marbled with strands of variegated yellow light. But as the girl went deeper, she pushed into a relentless midnight blue. She was swimming through the night in a bottomless lagoon. Miles she swam, hours. Finally, she neared an underwater rock cavern and saw a shimmery Dom waiting, dressed in a full black suit. As she came closer, she saw it wasn't Dom at all, but her father. No, not her father. It was the dead man, Sven, her uncle. He offered her the same measured smile he'd sent across the street as her tiny boy of a father smashed through a window and fell to the ground in a tumble of smoke and glass and flecked blood. Underwater, she chortled in fascinated recognition, that deep-throated laugh, and the laugh must have burbled its way to the surface because Dom found her then. His hands grasped her ankles, and he flung her back away from the cavern until she couldn't see a single rock, until only the slightest impression of Sven's smile remained, and even that too soon vanished. Such speed, such speed. She'd swum gently through the cool dark of the lagoon, and now she was infuriatingly propelled, Dom's arm laid tightly across her chest. They crashed through the surface. He dragged her to the ground. Sven joined them again, a short distance away, looking as pissed as Dom remembered from those nights he'd arrive at the tavern as if summoned. "You're back," Dom told the girl, Delphine, as she began to breathe again on her own. "No," she howled, feeling real anxiety for the first time in her brief life. "No, no, no." She pushed herself up on her elbows and scanned the thin, empty shore. "No," she said again, a whisper of a wail in a little girl voice. "Oh yeah," Dom said. "He's gone now for good." He recovered their twisted and tumbled clothes from behind a rock, and they dressed in a sudden hot wind, pushing damp feet into shoes and bending back into the taunting tunnel, the narrowing stream, the climb back towards the others. They would be almost dry by the time they reached the Birdfoot Violent again. And when they came to the house, the party would wind down all at once at the sight of Dom. The girl hardly noticed as she trudged beside him. Inside, she'd fall into Sven's recliner, looking for all the world as if she'd owned it, as if it owned her. She would close her eyes and plunge into a nap so deep she might have been fully drugged by the sun, the wind, the water. Dom, meanwhile, would survey the gathering, and even if no one had noticed his absence, they'd know he was back now. It was that look of his, they reckoned later, that upended even Sven. Open, yet opaque, utterly guileless but knowing. Stealthily, pockets were empty, valuables returned to drawers. Even a sandwich wrapped in a paper napkin meant for a quiet supper slipped back onto a tray. The guests filed out, the caterer and her crew gathered plates, scraped and washed, and packed the van in the new silence. Dom stood on the porch and saw the whole crowd off, one by one, until only his uncle's family remained. "Will you look at that?" the stepmother said, nudging her husband's arm and nodding towards the sleeping Delphine. "As if she's home at last," the stepmother added. "Do you think," she began. "You know," said the uncle to Dom, who'd caught every clue. "I bet Delphine would love to visit with you a while longer. Look how peaceful." "I'll carry her for you," Dom offered, and he swept in before they could refuse him. He settled her in the back seat of the uncle's car. Her eyes barely flickered, but she flinched as he moved away. "Good luck to you," he said, holding the door open for the stepmother, who motioned again and again to the uncle with her scant black eyebrows. "Say something," she implored. "Have you nothing for me, son?" the uncle said in a low voice as he shook Dom's hand one last time, offered him a final glance at this mild version of his father's face. Dom nearly laughed. "You don't want what I have left to give," he said, stepping away. Anyone in town would attest to that, he knew. Certain gifts come with unbearable conditions. His uncle of all people should know that and be grateful to Dom, who'd set the world half straight again. And shouldn't they all be grateful, Dom thought? Of course, of course. And they knew it. They did. In the coming days, wearing his single suit, Dom would take Sven's truck and visit each mourner. In the end, he'd sell more life insurance policies than he had in the last 2 years combined, a tiny bundle of profit all his own, the start of a whole new enterprise. Thank you.